Oh. Yeah. And how do you turn that lady off? It says recording in progress.
She is now built into Zoom.
It's so weird. Okay, we are now recording. Sorry, that took a little while. As I said, go ahead and put your information into the chat box so we know who's here. I may not be able to see it all, but all right, so we're ready to start. And Michelle and Saro, do you want to just open it up to questions? How do you want to proceed?
Yeah, I think Saro and I thought we'd come on here and see if you all have any questions about data, evaluation, or how to build your capacity to use data. So we're more than happy to take any questions. And if you don't have questions, I think we have a little bit of information to share.
And you can just turn on your mics and ask questions if you like.
Or if you're more comfortable, you can drop it into the chat as well. Shannon and I will both try to monitor and sort of verbalize those questions. I know that it can be intimidating to just jump in and start asking questions. So you might want to think about like what brought you here? Why were you drawn to this topic or this session title? And are there any more specific questions in that interest that really brought you here?
Saro, what are some of the tools that you guys are using, I assume, for evaluation, like what survey tools, et cetera?
So I'm going to let Michelle probably share a couple links and perhaps even a slide or two. I will say evaluation is quite specific to the programs that are being evaluated. And so in terms of a survey, I don't think that's the type of tool that we'll be sharing, but generally logic modeling and logic models are a foundational step in evaluations. And so we can definitely show you some templates and some examples of logic models. Of course, your own program's logic model is going to look different than what we share, but it'll give you a sense of like what this tool is and how it can be used. So I'll let Michelle do that.
Yeah, so in general, where you want to start is really thinking about what it is your organization does and how you think it'll ultimately achieve that. So that's what generally a logic model or a theory of change helps you clarify what are we doing, so your activities, and what do we hope comes out of it, or what do we hope changes because of it, and that would be your outcomes. And once you define that, then you can think about, okay, well, now that I know what my outcomes are, what are the options out there that will help me collect information related to those outcomes? And a lot of times there's already pre-made tools out there that other people have used that you can tweak to better fit your context. And sometimes it is simply about asking people whether or not they think you all achieved your outcome, depending on what it is you're working towards.
I think one of the things that we're a very small organization, but we serve like staff-wise, but we serve a lot of individuals. And I know one of the things we struggle with is we get a lot of sort of like anecdotal feedback from people that participate in our program. So we have good, I guess, qualitative stuff, but I think we're really kind of stuck on what types of quantitative things we can measure. And I know that that's very specific to each group, but if you guys could even offer some like suggestions of things, and I'm happy to give you like examples of the programs that we have, but we find that they're kind of difficult to come out with like number sort of stuff beyond the number of people that are participating in it. Does that make sense?
Can I just add one thing before you answer that question? I think Laura has hit on a really important point. Saro and Michelle think differently than someone like I think. I'm not a math person, I'm not a science person, and I think probably more like Laura, like I'm a storyteller, right? I know how to get the stories, I can do that. but I'm not even sure what questions I'm supposed to be asking to get the data I need. So even in that starting point, like our speaker yesterday said, something about if you're creating a library in another country and you're finding out how many books you can distribute, what's the definition of books? Well, I wouldn't have even thought to ask that question. So that's what I'm saying. So you guys, can you address this issue that Laura raised about, yes, the stories, the anecdotal stuff, we can do that. How do we even know what we're looking for otherwise?
So that's actually a really good segue from the previous comment that we made. So one of the best ways to approach, like, how do I know what data to collect? How do I know what questions to ask? Is through a process like your logic modeling process. Because what that will do, you can think of a logic model as like similar to a theory of change, but instead of focusing on sort of hypotheticals, right? Like here's the impact that we intend to have. And so here's why we are doing these things. And, we expect that, or we hope that it will have these kinds of outputs and these kinds of outcomes. What a logic model does is it actually talks about what is happening on the ground. And then based on what you identify as your activities and your outputs and your outcomes, what you can do is identify actual metrics or indicators that relate back to each one of those. So even if you think of like the simplest logic model, let's say that your program does one thing, right? Then you would say that you have just one activity. And I would imagine that your funders and others would be interested in, are you actually doing the one thing that you say that you do? So that's right there is one data point or one metric, right? What's the extent to which we are actually doing the activity that we say that we do, or that we seek funds to do, for example. But based on that activity, there are some products of doing the thing, right? So if you are, Laura, I forget which organization you're with. Remind me.
The Down Syndrome Association of Central Texas.
Perfect. So let's say you are providing, I'm not as familiar with Down syndrome, but let's say that there's an intervention that you provide to young individuals with Down syndrome. And so you're seeking funds to do that. And that's the one thing that your program does. So that's your activity. The output or the sort of countable product of that activity, easy one. What's the number of individuals that you provide that intervention to? And you might say, well, actually, our intervention is provided to families, not to individual youth or infants. And so you might instead choose to count the number of families that you provide your intervention to. And then depending on what your intervention is and how you work with those families, there might be an outcome that you expect. For example, you may expect that more students take advantage of pre-K educational services as a result of the intervention that you provide to your families. And so you would then ask or somehow keep track of the number of your clients who go on to enroll in pre-K. That's what a logic modeling process does, right? It specifies all of the steps that you're taking to get from the things that you do, or even before that, right? The inputs, the context that you're working in, the problem that you're trying to solve, the community that you're working in. It takes you from there step by step to the impact that you hope to achieve. And each one of those things will then let you know, what are we trying to keep track of? What should we be keeping track of? And I did also want to say, I know Michelle is itching to jump in here too, but I did also want to say, like, we do not, or I do not personally consider quantitative data to be more rigorous or more evidence than qualitative data. So you may find after you go through this process that a lot of the stories that you're already collecting are exactly aligned with your outputs and your outcomes and your impacts. And so you're already collecting the type of data that you need and you want, and your stories are rich and they are participant driven or community driven, and they are filled with just the right type of information. So you may go through this process and decide, oh, we actually are already collecting the type of data that is most relevant, most aligned to the impact we are trying to have.
Yeah, just to add to that, so I, like Saro, believe qualitative data is data, and it's just as valuable, and oftentimes you get more insights from qualitative data that you couldn't necessarily get with the numbers. So it helps you explore why things are the way they are, how they came to be, and it might even help you capture some unexpected changes when you have that qualitative information. So a lot of organizations already collect testimonials, and what you need to do to turn those testimonials into data is be systematic about the way you go about collecting those testimonials. So I mean by being consistent, so ask everyone to give you feedback, whether they'll give you positive feedback or provide some constructive criticism. Ask things from different perspectives. So perhaps you ask the child what their experiences were like, you ask parents, you ask teachers, and then make sure that the way you're asking for feedback doesn't include embedded biases. So for example, instead of asking people, did you like our program? You just ask them, can you tell me what your experience was with our program? And doing that, it will help you every single time being systematic. So being consistent, thinking about how you might incorporate different perspectives or different sources of information, and making sure you avoid biases is going to help make sure that your testimonials are data points that you can use.
Hey, Michelle, do you have a slide with a picture of a logic model on it by any chance?
Yeah, let me find that here.
I have a question, ladies. How do you feel about Likert scales?
So lots of feelings. The premise that I start from on the quantitative side, and full transparency, I'm quantitatively trained. So I do have an implicit bias that I'm actively working against towards quantitative data. Your analysis and your findings are only as good as your measures, right? So basically garbage in, garbage out, right? If your data are collected using, let's put it this way. If you're trying to make high stakes decisions based on data that were collected through instruments that are not valid or reliable, then there is a disconnect there, right? So there's no such thing as a bad survey on its own. It sort of depends on like, what is the decision that you're trying to make using this survey? So for example, if you are, let's say you run an annual event, that's what your nonprofit does. And you are trying to figure out if the food that you serve at the event is something that people find valuable, or if they would prefer you spend that money on something else in the event, maybe a nicer venue, or maybe providing transport to the event instead of providing food at the event. You can just ask, right? Like you don't need to have a valid and reliable survey of like, what are the things that we provide at our, like that's way overkill, because the decision that you're trying to make is very practical, and it's not going to have like long-term consequences on like the quality of people's lives or the quality of the services that you provide or your ability to seek and sustain funding for your community, right? It's just going to say, well, we'll continue doing food, or we'll switch to like bus vouchers or whatever. Maybe they want childcare instead of food, like, right? So in that case, a Likert scale is just fine, right? How you can even do a multiple choice, but you can say like, how valuable is the food that we provide? If we provided transport, how valuable would it be? If we provided childcare, how valuable would it be? And you just ask people to make a sort of a numerical judgment on a Likert scale. That's just fine. If, however, you're trying to talk about the effectiveness of your program, and you're trying to say like, people learned something, or people changed their behavior, or there is like a concrete specific outcome that has been moved, like you have more individuals enrolled in pre-K, or more high school graduates, youth transition, yeah, like you have more youth successfully transitioning from school to career, for example, then you might not consider a Likert scale for that type of analysis and question that you're asking, right? You might consider, are there extant data that I can have access to that tells me concrete numbers about the number of, you know, youth I have served, and then the number that have transitioned into career or independent living or whatever it is that they're transitioning to. So every tool sort of has a place. Now there can be such a thing as a bad item itself, you know, like an item that is worded in a confusing way, or that can have multiple meanings, or is double or triple barreled. So you ask someone about 3 things and so they're having to make a call. They're like, well, what if this one thing is great, but these other 2 things are abysmal? What do I pick? And then I like to have a neutral or a central option. So I like to have an odd number, 5 or 7 response options. I know that there are some folks who feel very strongly that they're like, there is no neutral, there's no way to be neutral. And I want to force people to be either on one side or the other. That gets into a whole bunch of statistics and psychometrics, which most of the time, again, is sort of overkill for the types of questions that are being asked and answered.
I only ask about that because this is a brand new nonprofit, and I am going to need to do a research study through the IRB at the university, you know, in order to pilot the program with a certain population that we have at, you know, a certain program that we have at the university. So that's why I was just asking. One of my mentors did mention to me a different type of study, but honestly, I would have to pull up his email. I haven't spoken to him a lot during the summer, but I was just asking only because of that. It's not, I can't measure anything yet at this point because we haven't really done anything yet. So pretty much what I really wanted to evaluate is, you know, if I could just do like a little pilot study and see, you know, how that sort of ran. But I'm not even sure what else I could study as far as just testing out the courses that we would be offering to the youth. I'm not even exactly sure what else I could test at this point.
So a couple of things that I wanted to share, going back to the Likert scale before I get to how to find tools to measure specific outcomes. One thing to keep in mind is how much are you investing in the program itself. If it's a huge program and there's a lot of money going into it, then your evaluation is going to be have more resources invested in it itself. That will mean wanting to go out and having validated tools and do something that's considered traditionally like more complex in terms of collecting data. If you have a small program, for example, if we were going to evaluate the effectiveness of this session, we might have a quick survey that just has a lot of Likert scaled questions that we came up with ourselves. Because it's a small intervention, we're not investing all the resources in it. But if you have like a multi-year $1 million project, you're gonna wanna spend more time collecting evidence that it worked and that it paid off. So that's something to keep in mind when you're deciding on which tools to use. One of the things I do when I'm trying to find options for collecting data is I think about what are the outcomes I'm trying to reach, especially those short-term outcomes. So for example, let's say you have, if I remember correctly, you're working with foster youth. Let's say you're trying to teach them financial literacy. So I will go on Google Scholar. That's one of the places where you can just look for what other researchers have done. And I would put youth financial literacy in there and see how they're exploring that concept. Are there survey tools they're using? What sort of methods are they using? Are they just interviewing youth about their financial literacy? Do they use surveys? Do they use focus groups, observations? What sort of data are they collecting? So again, one of the first things to do is to figure out what are our outcomes, especially those short-term outcomes. So when people leave our intervention or finish our program, what do we expect them to have achieved or changed in their lives? And then see how other people have measured those tools.
What could you call that? Google what? Where do they go?
Google Scholar. So Google, yeah. So type in Google Scholar into Google and it'll pop up a database. And that database will just pop up different research papers or working papers or position papers, and sometimes even like news articles of related to that topic. So for example, if you're interested in youth financial literacy, I would just Google youth financial literacy and see what other people are doing. But like we mentioned before, one of the first things to do is figure out or reflect on what it is your activities are and what changes you hope to see because of those activities.
So fantastic. You guys are definitely speaking my language. I love Google Scholar.
One thing, so if you're affiliated at all, or if you have partners or colleagues that are university based, I would encourage you to lean on them as well. They need to get publications out of this. And I know unless it's a Research One university where they're all saying, well, I don't do research unless it's grant funded, most faculty will be happy to work with you on a research study at no cost to you, right? To help you sort through. Yeah.
Oh yeah, my faculty advisor is definitely going to help me with that. I'm actually just going into my graduate program. So yes, I have all the resources. Yeah, I have all the resources available. So that's pretty great.
The other thing I would say is if you're an incoming graduate student is lean on your librarians. They can definitely help you out with things like searches and which databases to search and like how to identify peer review versus non-peer review resources and all sorts of things. So just make an appointment. Sometimes they do walk-ins, but your librarians are one of your biggest assets in your grad school career, as well as in answering this question. And then the other thing I'll say is one thing that I'm sort of a champion of right now is you're at a really, you have a big opportunity right now because your program is new to really start with what we call participatory or community-based evaluation, in that you have a bunch of youth who are attending your classes and receiving other services that would love to let you know what you should be studying, right? They would love to tell you, here's what I'm getting out of this. Here's what I wish. And you can start with questions like, do you think people should continue to fund this program? And if they say yes, what would you tell them? Why? Why do you think they should fund it, right? What would you tell them to convince them that this is worthy of funding? And you'll get all sorts of outputs and outcomes through that process that you cannot sit in a room and think about on your own, right? You're going to get all sorts of unintended benefits. They're going to tell you unintended consequences too, which is ultimately a good thing, right? For program improvement. But really engaging with your clients, with those that you serve from the get-go, is an awesome way to make sure that you are not overlooking and that you're not sort of doing to your community, but you're actually doing with your community what will ultimately improve.
Very important. And I will mention here that this year we've had several meetups that look at traditional nonprofit topics through a diversity, equity, inclusive lens. And one of our members said something in one of our meetups the other day. We've been quoting her. Cynthia said this. She said, if you don't include the people you serve in making these decisions about everything, your communications, your fundraising, your evaluation, if you don't include the people you serve, you're only serving your own superiority. Oh, I love that statement.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why participatory approaches work so well is because if you do them right, people are going to trust you more. And two, they're going to tell you what sort of data collection methods will work and what won't. So I worked with a 4-H program out in Arizona, and they used to do surveys at the end of each program, and they would use those to make decisions about which programs to continue next year and which ones to sunset and what new programs to have that the youth would be interested in. And the youth would basically come in and just fill that out quickly, saying everything is great, and then they would move on. And the youth felt like, I don't know what this is going towards. I'm not sure if I should really spend the time and effort really thinking about these questions and answering it. So instead of doing a survey, they held an evaluation skill-a-thon, we called it, where they basically provided feedback to each other about the programs they really liked and what they thought increased some of their confidence, their goal setting skills, and other outcomes the 4-H program was specifically interested in. And they sort of reviewed the results themselves during that session and came up with the implications moving forward for themselves. And it was an opportunity for them to, one, provide data to the organization, to practice using data, and 3, make sense of that data at the end and really provide guidance to the program leads on what programs they wanted to see next year. So it was a great way for the youth to really be a part of that decision-making process. And really, you're collecting data so that you can make informed decisions about what improvements to make, what adaptations to make. So anything you can do so that people are inclined to give you the most accurate information about what improvements to make, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. We are trying to work with, you know, our target audiences. It's difficult with kids that are still in the foster system. Here they can be in the foster system until they're 21, but everything has to be anonymous. We can't, you know who they are or see them or anything like this. And but I do have on this website that we created a way for them to meet one another and speak with one another, and also ask questions of the course creators, and be a part of, you know, like a self-healing community. And one of our departments within the Department of Children and Families said the same thing. He said, basically, we as professionals, you know, tend to want to tell the youth what they need to do, and then we parachute in and save them. He said, but it shouldn't be that way. He said, they're the ones that need to make the decisions as to what they feel that they need is important to them. And this is where I really like that, because I do think that it's very important to the youth to know what do they think that would help them transition from, you know, one place to another place. And I think if I start at the university, that might be the best choice also, because those are sort of already students that have already sort of are in the middle of transitioning. And then another target audience is probably going to be the juvenile justice system, which another mentor at the Office of Resilience has me looking at that right now. So that's going to be a different split off. So we'll see how that works. But thank you. You're giving me a lot of information so far.
You know, that reminds me that it really is very dependent on the type of programs that you're running in terms of what tools you'll need to choose for measurement. And this is why I believe that it's important to work with people like Michelle and Saro, because people like me don't know how to do that. I've been in the nonprofit world for 35 years, and I can do a little bit. Like, I just have one example I pulled up from my last, when I was the executive director at the Palace Theater. We had an education department, and we had, I think, 6 or 8 programs for youth in theater programs, right? And we did this thing, I just found it on my computer, it's kind of old, but all that we knew to do is, what's the need? What did we think the need was for this particular program? What outcome were we looking for? What were the indicators of success? And then what measurements were we going to use? And as far as I know, we made this all up. We didn't, you know, like, there was one for the older kids where we wanted them to be ready for admission to colleges offering a Bachelor of Fine Arts degrees. And that did seem okay. Maybe we picked the right need there, but I don't remember. I mean, some of them, I'm sure the director of the education department probably asked the parents, but for the most part, I think way back when you're thinking of these things, you're defining that what need are you solving? You know, why are you in existence? I think you've got to talk to the people you think you're going to be serving. You know, it's interesting today to look at this old. I mean, we probably got some of it right, but maybe just accidentally. What other questions do you guys have? Oh, I'm reading the chat here. That's from Saro.
I can spend some time verbalizing. I just didn't want to squelch. I didn't want to like derail the conversation. But while you're thinking of your next question, so last year I worked with a statewide Girl Scout chapter, and usually they would do the same thing, right? Surveys at their last meeting, but because of COVID, they weren't meeting, you know, at all over the summer, and then not very frequently other than that. And so they had to rethink their data collection strategy, and what they landed on, I think, was an improvement on what they used to do, because it used to be a survey that, you know, a bunch of adults thought of and had like 10 questions, and they would give it to the scouts, and the scouts never saw it again. They didn't know what it was for. In some cases, they might have been, you know, for maybe slightly older scouts, they didn't know if they were going to get someone in trouble if they said they didn't like something, or, you know, and they would just fill it out and turn it in and didn't even think about it. But instead, what they landed on was, so they had shifted to virtual meetings, and they were able to train a small group of older scouts to essentially lead focus groups among the scouts. So it was just a meeting of just, they were all scouts. They were not in the same troop necessarily, but a lot of times they were. And the scouts themselves were able to lead a focus group that just talked about, like, what do you like about scouts? Which are the best programs? Which are the programs that you're least interested in? Like, if you signed up multiple years, why did you come back? And they got lots of rich information about things they didn't even think of, like, my 3 best friends are in my troop. Of course I'm going to come back, right? Or, you know, I really did not like my troop leader this year, and I think I'm going to do something else. And, you know, being able to dig into that, well, what didn't you like about them? Did something happen, or was it just a style, or did they focus on things that you're less interested in? All sorts of things. And then as a follow-up, they had parents or guardians, so family, adults in a family, interview their scouts. And this was somewhat trickier, right? Because they were also gathering data from the adults. So a lot of times adults are the ones that are making decisions about whether or not to re-enroll and which programs to enroll in. And so by having that be an interview, they're like, hey, I want to talk to you about your scouts. Are you liking it? Do you want to go back? You know, or maybe we've already decided that you can't go back. Like, are you disappointed? Do you wish you could go? And so they were able to gather information from the families for the first time ever, because they couldn't send home a survey before, as well as the scouts, to dig deeper into, you know, what aspects of programming should they change? What aspects of programming should they double down on and continue? And I just thought it was really, unique. And so hearing that other example that Michelle gave reminded me of that.
Couple of questions I have. One is about consistency in measurement tools. Wait a minute, let me write this down. And then, okay. So let's say you have one program. Let's just keep it simple. One program, and it's something simple. I'm not as good as you guys are at thinking of examples, but just has maybe 1 or 2 data points. Okay, and so you've come up with a good measuring tool. Michelle has approved it. You know, I mean, you figure you're going to get the information you want. And in 5 years down the road, somebody, the staff changes. And now they've decided we want to measure something totally different. What's the problem with that? Is there, I mean, on the one hand, I believe in adaptation and modification, but you also have to be aware of comparing apples with apples and not apples with oranges, right? Especially for funders. Funders want to know that your impact, what you're talking about, has credibility. So what do you think about that? How does that work with consistency of measurement tools?
For me, one of the things I think is really important, most important, is that the data you're collecting is actually useful. So are you using it to make decisions, improvements, adaptations, understand what's working well and what's not? And does it help you make your case to potential supporters or funders? So if it's not doing any of that, then, and you've been collecting it for 20 years or whatever, it's not helpful because you're not using it. So as long as it's useful, you should consider keeping it and continue to collect it. That I think is the best thing to do. Now, if let's say your interests have changed and now you're no longer interested in, for example, let's say you've been collecting information about participants' confidence in their financial literacy. And that's what you've been collecting it for 20 years. And let's say like, okay, well, we're not necessarily interested in that particular change anymore. We're interested in something else. And therefore, maybe we should start collecting data differently because of that. Then I think it depends on what are your outcomes. Have your outcomes really changed? And if they have, then you should start collecting information about the new outcomes you're interested in. I think the focus should be on what is actually useful to your organization. And I think one of us mentioned it before, like garbage in, garbage out. So if you've been collecting something that's not useful, or you've been collecting it or asking the question in a way that's confusing, it's better to have good data right now that's helpful and useful than have like a long database of data that's not as clear or as useful as you'd like. So I don't know, Saro, what your thoughts are on that.
No, definitely, you know, plus 100 to everything Michelle just said. And you might want to frequently or regularly, if not frequently, revisit, are you actually comparing? Because oftentimes you're not really comparing unless you have like a multi-year grant and a funder that's kept their reporting consistent over multiple years, which we all know that also isn't necessarily a given. Then there really is no need to sort of prioritize consistency over, like Michelle said, being responsive, being flexible, and making sure that your data continues to be meaningful and useful. So there is, yes, definitely, if you're doing a pre-test and a post-test, you want those measures to be consistent. But are you also implementing a program where you can expect to see measurable changes on a pre-test and a post-test? And if not, then maybe you shouldn't be doing a pre-test and a post-test, right? Or if you are, let's say, so I work a lot in education. Let's say you're doing something across the semester, as an intervention or a new class that you're teaching. There may be reasons that you want to measure something at the beginning and something at the end. But then the next class or the next time you do it, like Michelle said, you might have a different interest, or your composition of students may have changed enough that question and that measure is no longer the most relevant, most meaningful one. And so I would always encourage, like, think about, yes, we shouldn't prioritize consistency just for the sake of consistency. If we are doing comparisons, we want to make sure that we are comparing faithfully. So that's one case where you would want to prioritize consistency, but that's not always the case. And the other thing you should be asking yourself is, are there ways that your data collection methods and measures are systematically excluding certain voices, right? And so it may be something as simple as, we do an online survey because we serve so many people that we can't do paper and pencil. And what that means is the only responses we ever get back are from our clients who have access to the internet, who have a device that they can use on their own time, and who have the facility to complete an online survey. And what does that mean? Does that represent most of our clients? Does that represent only a few of our clients? In which case, it might be worth throwing out the online survey and saying, let's do a phone call, right? As well, maybe in addition to, or instead of. And you may be asking very different questions, because it's a phone conversation is quite different, right, than an online survey. Or if anyone's ever tried to do the phone equivalent of an online survey where they read you like on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 means this and 5 means that, like, you're not going to get a lot of uptake. So that's another reason, compelling reason to consider whether consistency is really serving your needs.
That's a really good point. I've actually thought of 2 more questions. One is comparing the one to the many. So when I was working at the Palace Theater, I called Mike up at Meadows Foundation. Mike, what's his name? McCoy. I wanted to, at Meadows Foundation, to get a grant, if you don't make them laugh or cry on the first page of your grant, you don't even go in the pile that's going to be considered. Anybody in Texas knows that, you know, if you're seeking funds from Meadows. So I thought I had a really compelling story, and I wanted to run it by Mike before I submitted the grant. And the story was, we had a gal, an autistic gal in one of our little youth theater programs. And when she got there, she never spoke out loud to anyone, not even her parents. She always whispered. She would come up real close to you and talk quietly. And then by halfway through the program, she was doing theater. She was on the stage. She was a young gal, less than 12 years old. And then eventually, we were trying to get a permit to build a building for a new youth education for the department for doing that. And she went to the city council and spoke on our behalf about getting the permit. So that's a very compelling story of how much impact, and it's a story. It's the one. Now, Mike said, I called him, I told him the story, and he said, yes, it's a very compelling story, but how is that relevant on a community-wide basis? How can you tell me about the impact in the community? And that's where I was at a loss. I mean, I could go and look up the benefit of theater, you know, I could look at random studies, but what should have I been doing?
A couple of things come to mind to me is how many of your participants had compelling stories that you weren't able to capture because it wasn't obvious, or you didn't see that big shift in your face sort of shift. So one, what you should have been doing is consider, how do we capture these compelling stories in a systematic way so that it's consistent, we consider different perspectives, and that we don't ask in a way that leads towards bias. So if you have a bank of stories, then you can say, like, how many of these, how to what extent is this particular individual's change an exception from what most of our participants experienced? So that's one thing to know. What I would do is think about what was the thing that changed in this particular individual. For example, maybe it was social skills. Is there a way we can measure social skills across all our participants? And that way we could say, here is an example of one individual's story, and they're not just one person who changed because of their program, but they represent this larger group of people who have experienced an improvement in their social skills. And we know that because we're collecting that data in this particular way. So two things. One is figure out a way to collect those compelling stories in a consistent way or a systematic way. And two, how can you show that the outcomes you're seeing are not just happening for one person, but they're happening for a group? And then you can highlight individual people from that group.
Okay.
I'm just gonna ditto everything Michelle said. Basically both, right? Like you should have been doing both of those things, going into the research and continuing to collect those stories systematically.
I think part of my problem was identifying what was important to measure. Like Michelle just jumped right to social skills. I see that escaped me. And that's why I think we in the nonprofit world need to hire people like Michelle and Saro, because we don't think that way. It's just something that keeps getting driven home to me more and more, that I wouldn't even have thought of that, Michelle. That's exactly right. Social skills, of course.
So I'm gonna put in a quick plug. So yes, you should be hiring us, but also there are resources out there that can help you and your nonprofit get this done in a way that is affordable to you and your nonprofit, so that you're not losing access to this type of, information. So Capacity Catalyst, our signature program, is an externship program, and we match an extern with a nonprofit or any social sector organization, but they've mostly been nonprofits, in order to complete a data research evaluation project over the summer. And so we have part-time externs and full-time externs. Part-time externs are doing more like 200 hours of work over the summer. Full-time externs are doing closer to 300 hours of work over the summer. And the way that we structure it is they get a flat stipend. So part-time is getting $4,000, full-time is getting $7,500. We get on top of that an additional $1,000 or $500, depending on, just to cover the cost of the externship, because what we provide to the externs are cohort support, individual support, mental and emotional wellness support, and connection to a community-based mentor that begins a lifelong relationship of professional mentorship for that extern. And what the host organization gets is a completed project that would not have happened otherwise. In addition, we have a pay what you can model for nonprofits that are led by people of the global majority. So those folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, where we say you contribute to your extern stipend what you can, whether it's $500, whether it's $25, whether it's $0, and we waive all of our fees. So, and then we co-fundraise or we fundraise for your organization in order to cover your extern's fee. We also pay honoraria to all our speakers and our providers. So we fairly and fully compensate everyone involved for their work, but that cost is not prohibitive to nonprofits, right? So that was my quick plug. I did get a question, a private question. Do we have general guidance about how often to review data and what we're asking participants? Especially thinking about ongoing programs, is twice a year a good time frame in general? And I'm going to make a broad statement, which I almost never do, and say, like, yes, twice a year seems very reasonable. Of course, it's very dependent on your program and how often. If you're offering the same service 3 times in a quarter, then maybe twice a year is not enough, right? But if your service really is a year-long offering or a year-and-a-half-long offering, twice a year might be a bit much to be reviewing, what data you're asking. But definitely in terms of like participant engagement and community engagement, community-driven evaluation, I would say like every 6 months or so, you definitely want to be making sure that that community and those participants are engaged in some way. So it may be a review of your data collection, a review of your data, a review of the questions. It may be a review of the logic model to say like, is this still where we are and what we think? It may be just a review of like, how is this going for you? Are there things about the evaluative process that are working well or not working well? You want to make sure that you are consistently that those folks are really involved in the process and not just like, leaned on when it's convenient for you. I like to say, think of it instead of, I know we love to say, well, we need to set a place at the table for our participants and community members. And I like to remind people that that really assumes that it's your table, you're cooking the meal, you decide when it happens, and then you invite them, right? Instead, what we should be thinking about is, how do we humbly go to our clients, our participants, our communities, and seek a place at their table? And it's a perspective shift, but it's a meaningful one. And I think, you have less questions about like, well, how often should I do that when you take that perspective shift, because then they're really driving, or at least co-driving the process with you, and you will find the cadence that works for everyone.
Wow. That's very powerful.
Another thing I wanted to add to that is, one of the things I love to do is sense-making sessions, or some people call them data parties. And this is where you invite people to review the data. So anytime you all know your programs best and you know how they flow and what the best time to ask participants or stakeholders to review data might be. But anytime you can do something like that, to have them review the data that you've been collecting so far, ask them like, what are you noticing? What didn't meet your expectations? What surprised you? And what does this make you wonder? Or what do you wish we would have collected if you can start? That can be a place for you to, one, review the data you have and make sense of it and think about potential implications for your programming, but also to think about potential implications for your evaluations. Perhaps when you're having these conversations, people say, well, I wish we would have had information about this particular thing. Then you can start to think about how will we add that into our evaluations moving forward.
Well, I do have another question, but I definitely want to give other participants. This is a topic that's not in my wheelhouse. I mean, I have a lot of expertise in nonprofit topics. This is not one of those topics. So I'm really grateful for the two of you being here today. So let me ask this other question. So when I worked at Travis Audubon, we had that outdoor youth education program where we connected with a local elementary school, local meaning very close to our East Side Nature Preserve. And we brought kids out from that school and taught them science essentially, but hands-on, like removing non-native plants. Why were we doing that? And planting native plants. And we had them do things like, the most fun activity to me was they would roll mud balls from the stream, they'd get in there and with their hands and get all muddy and roll these mud balls up and then roll them into native seed and throw them up the riparian corridor. And then the next spring come back and they could see that, that they were growing, so and that was one of many of these very cool activities. One of the problems I got, and the woman who ran this, she had a master's in science education. So she did really well with evaluation in terms of before and after. But what I wanted to do, because the school was telling us that these kids were performing better academically, I wanted to start following these kids. So I think that's kind of a problem for nonprofits that might not have the capacity is, how do you do evaluation down the road? What was your impact? What's your impact later on? How do you do that?
So that is definitely more challenging for a number of reasons. One is that it is hard to secure funding now for something down the road. And conversely, it's hard to secure funding for something down the road that happened years ago. Two is that there's a whole bunch of like data privacy and sort of respect for the individual, right? In terms of, well, just because they participated in a program one time doesn't mean that you now have the right to follow them forever. And definitely when it comes to education data, then you have to start interfacing with school districts if that's the type of data you want to access to. So that presents lots of challenges as well, especially if your program is not directly provided in or by the school itself. And so I would say, I am a nonprofit leader, but like if I were in your position, I would sort of think of that differently than evaluation of my programming. And I would seek funds for that and talk about that as sort of a different aspect of understanding our programming. So instead of saying like, this is an internal and external evaluation, and this is why we're gathering this data, I would sort of think about like, what can we learn now about students that we worked with in the past, and how would that influence our programming? How would it change things? What would we do with that information? Because yeah, it's a super interesting question. And the researcher in me is like, oh, but kind of makes sense. And I would love to know more. But the pragmatist in me, the nonprofit leader in me is like, okay, but then you go through all this effort and you spend all these resources to get all this data, and you find, let's say it worked, right? Let's say, yes, the kids who participated did do better. One, you would have to figure out the extent to which you could claim or know that that was due to your program versus a whole bunch of other potential factors. But two, what would you do with that? Would you do something different? Would you try to expand your program, right? Like, and approach it from that point and from that perspective, and then say like, this might be a whole other thing actually. And so we might need to seek a standalone grant for this, or we might need to hire a staff person part-time to work on just this, because it's not really, there's a loose alignment, right, to programming and program development, but not a tight one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was just a fun concept. It turned out that one of the gals that participated in that program in the 4th grade, her grandmother ran the after-school program there, and she was so impressed with the kids that she thought were troublemakers. She never saw them not be troublemakers. So the grandma was so impressed. She wanted that young girl to keep connected with us. So we did keep connected with her, and she came on as a youth leader eventually, and then went on to win a lot of awards. And then we gave her an award through our annual event. We created a youth award where we had not had one before. So it was one person we followed all the way through. So that's why I always thought, boy, I bet there's a lot more people like this that we helped and didn't even know. So anyway, just that was a side note, sorry.
A couple things that came to mind is, one, I think we all have to be a little more open to the concept that we might contribute to a change as opposed to cause it. Because we don't want, the youth we're helping or the people we're serving to stop participating in every other resource just so that we can prove that we were the magic sauce. Instead, we want to think about, okay, how can we describe how we contributed as opposed to that we were the only ones that led to this change. And another thing I think nonprofits should do is to see opportunities as like relationship building opportunities. So perhaps that isn't necessarily an opportunity. The focus of that opportunity is not to collect data, but maybe to engage a person who participated in your program years ago and just check in on them to build a relationship with them. And they might be a supporter of your group because they participated in your program. So it's not necessarily, as Saro was saying, the focus might not be data collection, but you can gather some information there too in a systematic way. Say like, hey, we're just reaching out to people who participated in our program when they were young. just tell us what your experience was like, and would you like to support our organization moving forward? It could be a way for you to collect a little bit of data, to have a little bit of information to share those stories. But the focus there might not be data collection, but relationship building.
That's a great point. You know, I just realized something. There's a lot of new people here today. And I didn't say in the beginning, we usually go for about 90 minutes, but not always. Sometimes we close up early. And so I just want to, I want to go back to this for a second. There. Okay. So let's see if people have other questions. And I'm sorry, just a minute. You know, you guys, I am terrible at this. So can you see my screen as not in presentation mode, just, okay.
Yes, you see this, yeah.
Okay, I just want to see if people have some other questions, and I lost my chat when I did this. This is why I always get freaked out about sharing my screen, because I lose my chat. And one thing I wanted to tell Michelle and Saro both, and I see that you guys have been doing this along the way, is these ladies are such an amazing resource. I wanted to make sure they were sharing links with you, like that extern program that Saro was talking about, and Michelle's, I think Michelle, have you shared some of your stuff on here? I can't go back that far for some reason. I just want to make sure you two ladies are doing that. And then I want to tell people that if you click on the 3 dots down there at the bottom of the chat, right-hand side, you can save your chat box. So for those of you who don't know how to do that. Okay, are there any more questions right now before I move to a couple other things here? Please feel free. I didn't mean to cut off the discussion. I just want to leave a little time for a few other things. And I know people like to end early when they can. There's a lot to evaluation. And I did want to add that tomorrow in the Facebook group, my Friday find is Michelle's video on YouTube called, I think it's called, is it using the Kellogg logic model? Something like that?
I have a video about the Kellogg logic model. Kellogg puts a lot of resources out there for nonprofits, and this is a older one on how to develop a logic model. So I just run through what they suggest and provide a little more explanation in that video.
And I noticed
I have a small YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I'm always looking for content ideas. So if you all ever want to reach out and say, like, I'm curious about this or that, feel free to do so.
And do you have your email? You both Saro and Michelle, did you put your email in the chat box? Make sure to do that.
Yes, I will add it.
Yes, I've seen a few of Michelle's videos on her YouTube channel. What I like is they're short and informative. I really like that. And people like me can understand them. So if your eyes glaze over, like Saro said in the description, you might want to watch some of those videos. All right, so what's coming up for Austin Nonprofit Meetup? Let me tell you. I'm just going to do it this way instead of full screen, guys. Next Tuesday, we continue our concept of evaluation with Christian Bell, and I don't know how to say her last name yet.
Onyemali.
Okay, and I think you recommended her, right, Saro? Yes. And she's going to be talking about logic models also. On Tuesdays, we do these 15-minute live interviews at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. So if you want to get into the Austin Nonprofit Facebook group, get in there tomorrow before 11 so that you can watch that. Now, they do stay up there. The recordings do stay up in the group. So if you can't watch it right at 11, you can watch it a little bit later. I never delete these things. We've had some amazing guests, and thanks to Saro and Cynthia Herrera for recommending these amazing people. And then here is my email, my website, and here's the Facebook group. And you know, you can't copy and paste the URL anymore without getting the fancy name. So, but you can go into Facebook and just type in Austin Nonprofit Meetup. You'll get into the group and be able to watch those live 15-minute interviews. And then finally, I want to tell you about my course that's coming up. And the enrollment for this starts Monday, actually. And this is a live, interactive, collaborative course. You'll join a cohort of nonprofit leaders, 1 hour per week for 5 weeks. And together we'll apply what we learn in 4 virtual lessons. And those lessons are very short. I always try to keep everything as short as I can for nonprofit leaders. Your supporters are moved to act when they emotionally connect to your mission through story. If you want your supporters to give bigger, volunteer more, and champion your cause in the community, then you'll want to enroll in this course. Consistently crafting compelling stories is only possible when you foster a culture of storytelling. So you're going to learn in this course how to jumpstart your storytelling culture, gather your hidden story gems, and then craft and tell inspiring stories that move your supporters into action. Okay, that was my little commercial. The live course is limited to 8 participants. Enrollment begins Monday and ends on September 6th. Class starts on September 10th, and each of the 5 classes will be held at noon on Fridays. That's Central Standard Time. The cost is $150. The first promotion will say there are 8 spaces available, but if any of you want to reserve a space, you can do that by emailing me at nancy@poweryourmission.com. So I hope some of you will join me. I will have the course completely uploaded over the weekend. And if anybody wants to reserve a spot by emailing me, I will send you the early enrollment link by the end of the weekend. Okay. Any more questions? Any questions? Just speak up, feel free. I'm going to stop the share. And I do, of course, want to thank not only everybody that came, but our speakers. I know we could have gone on and on because there's so much I don't know. I could have come up with several more questions, I'm sure, but I really appreciate that you're willing to share your wisdom and your experience with us. And I want to thank everybody that came and thank Shannon for being my co-hostess. There she is. And remember, you can always get in touch with Shannon if you need some help in your nonprofit. Professional level help, I should add. Is there anything else anybody wants to say, or we're good? I really appreciate everybody coming today. Thanks, folks. I'll end it here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Nice.